Welcome back to my channel. So today I was thinking about my very first convention and the fact that it is no longer around, and I thought that we can dive into some of the rocky history and drama around Wizard World. If you're here looking for an update on my current Sakizo build, I have made lots of progress and I will be sharing that in a short video later this week. I just thought it would be more interesting in that format. Progress has been made. And as always, if you want to keep up with my competition cosplay builds, check out any tutorials I put together, convention reviews, behind the scenes guesting at conventions, that sort of thing, or you just really like my content and want to see more, make sure to hit that subscribe button. So as I said, Wizard World was my very first ever Comic-Con and my first introduction into cosplay. It had this really big impact on my life, and I think it's worth exploring what on earth happened to it. Ages ago, just a little backstory on me, ages ago, back in 2014, I attended Wizard World St. Louis, and I was absolutely floored by what I saw. That was my very first convention. I didn't know what to expect. It was huge. There were vendors filling up. It took place in, I believe it was called the Edward Jones Dome back in the day. It's where the former St. Louis Rams used to play football, and it is just a big stadium. And I believe they were taking up the majority of the available space. And there were just so many people, vendors everywhere, selling things that I've never seen before. And on top of it, they had real life celebrities that I could go and meet. At this convention, I was able to meet Sean Astin, shake his hand, get his autograph. Me, this little Midwestern girl that literally is from the middle of nowhere, got to meet this really big name celebrity from my favorite movie series, The Lord of the Rings. It was just life-changing that opportunities like that existed. I was even able that year to meet Matt Smith from Doctor Who said I was gorgeous, and for the first time in my life, granted I had never met stars before, but that was the first time in my life that I have ever been starstruck and rendered completely speechless. So I have a fun little photo of us, and I didn't really say much because I was nervous and didn't know what to say. It was such a surreal moment. And as you can see in this photo, this is actually my very first cosplay. They're all purchased pieces. The dress is from Abercrombie, I believe. The corset is from a vendor I ran into. I don't know the brand of that anymore, but I just purchased some things and put on some elf ears and called myself a steampunk elf. This is actually day 2 though of my experience at Wizard World, because I didn't know cosplay was a thing until the first day I went to Wizard World St. Louis. I really want to express at this time, and just growing up, I grew up in a tiny little farm town. We didn't get the internet until I was in middle school, and it barely worked. Cell phones. I got a cell phone when I was 16 because my dad didn't want me driving the country roads without having a way to contact anyone if something went wrong. But 9 times out of 10, the cell phone didn't have signal. I remember having to climb up on my bed and hold it in the corner of my room to get any signal. Yes, I'm dating myself here, but I just really want to emphasize the isolation that I had from other people who were like me. I was this little goth girl, like one of, if not the only goth girl in my town, and essentially one of 5 in my high school, which consisted of over 10 little farm towns that went there. Very small school, but kind of large for where it was at because there were so many towns there. And I was not friends with any of the other goth people. So I was kind of on an island of my own with my own interests. I always loved dressing up. Every Halloween, I would go trick-or-treating well beyond the age cutoff. When I went to college, I would come back and take my niece around and still dress up. I loved it. And I didn't realize that there was a community out there for people like me who loved costuming. To see that in real life and get exposed to this whole other world of nerdy things that I legitimately didn't know existed, it really was life-changing and put me on a completely different path in life than I ever thought I would be. Wizard World meant a lot to me. I can't express enough how exciting this experience was. And also, when I was wearing this cosplay, I had my very first what I call paparazzi experience. If you're a cosplayer, you know this happens periodically where you go to an event like Comic-Con and one person asks to take your photo, so you pose for them, and then another person hears that, turns around, just starts taking your photo, and then another person sees something going on, takes your photo, and so on and so forth till you're surrounded by people who are just taking photos. It's a little more organized in this day and age. People have more understanding of consent and will wait in line so that they can get a better photo. But at Wizard World St. Louis back in 2014, I was surrounded by people who were just taking my photo wearing this little purchased get up that I had, and it was just very exciting. And I mean come on, I'm a cosplayer, I loved the attention. I don't know, it was just a very special moment for me that people were appreciating the effort I put in, even if at that time the effort is so much smaller than what I do now, but there was some appreciation there, and I don't know, it was a nice experience. I met a lot of other cosplayers, and everyone that I asked about where they purchased their costume, most of the ones that I found out, they said they made it, and that was mind-blowing to me because I've always been a crafty person. I have an art degree and I have always loved just making things. I used to do a little sewing in high school and made a few of my own clothing pieces. They weren't good, but I enjoyed sewing, and I found out that these people were sewing their own cosplays, and it inspired me to pull out my sewing machine and dust it off and attempt to make a cosplay for the next year. And it was just, I don't know, I found my community. I was absolutely hooked. And I continued to go to Wizard World St. Louis every year that they had it. I even drove 6 hours to go to Wizard World to Des Moines, where I actually competed in my first ever cosplay contest. I didn't know cosplay contests were a thing. That was my first experience into it, and I was very excited to compete. It was just this little Sailor Moon outfit. I think this was the second one I ever made. It's not super great. Also, fun story, on the drive from Missouri to Des Moines, that you'll run into the American Gothic house, which is the background of this painting, and I got to take pictures in front of it, which was really cool. But yeah, so you can tell Wizard World played a huge role in my life, in my cosplay journey. And little did I know, when I started going to Wizard World, they were in the throes of issues, and it was spiraling from there. So let's go ahead and start with the beginning. So Wizard World was owned by Wizard Entertainment, which was a company founded in 1991, originally known as Wizard Press, and later rebranded into Wizard Entertainment. It was founded by Gareb Shamus. Wizard actually didn't start with live events at all. They were, as the name implies, a publisher. Wizard Press published a magazine titled Wizard. This was a pop culture magazine with a focus in, all things nerdy. We had comics and movies and anime, etc. And it wound up being pretty successful. So much so that Wizard Press created several more magazines, eventually diving into the world of comic book publishing in 2000 under the imprint named Black Bull Entertainment, though this was relatively short-lived because it stopped publishing in 2005. So they started in 1991, and by 1997 or 1996, the sources say various different dates, Wizard World decided to branch out and diversify into live events with the purchase of Chicago Comic-Con. This allowed them to bring their content directly to those who would be interested. They started publishing a magazine filled with nerdy things, bring it to the nerds. By the way, I want to point out nerd is an endearing term. I myself am a nerd. I don't think we take offense to the word nerd anymore. And if we do, I apologize, but come on, we're all nerds here. But this allowed them to directly market their magazine to the people who are going to read it. They renamed the event after themselves. They renamed it Wizard World Chicago. So the first ever Wizard World we had was Wizard World Chicago. And I find it very interesting that when Wizard World wound up closing down, Wizard World Chicago was also the last convention that they ever put on. So they both started and ended in Chicago. At this time, Comic-Cons were what you would think they would be. They're comic cons. Wizard World Chicago was a comic book convention. People would go to peruse the comics on sale, talk to artists who worked in the industry, buy comic book merchandise. But with the renaming, Wizard actually introduced a new kind of convention, which is a pop culture convention. No longer was this Comic-Con specifically geared towards comic books. Instead, they reforged it to be like their magazine, centered around movies and anime, and this allowed them to reach a broader audience. They brought together pop culture fandoms, they brought together video games, and they branched out the celebrities that they would bring in, expanding beyond just comic book artists. This was something relatively new, and it wound up being very successful. Growing year over year, over 10 years, they reached 58,000 people in attendance at Wizard World Chicago, which is actually pretty amazing because if you compare it to a couple very large popular conventions today, that was really good. And that was back in like 2005, 2006. So if you compare it to something like MomoCon, which just celebrated 25 years, this year in 2025, they had an attendance of 59,000 people. Or you can compare it to DragonCon, which has been around since 1987. And they had an estimated attendance last year of 72,000 people. So to reach 58,000 people in 10 years is actually really good. So with their success in Chicago, Wizard World decided to create a second event in Pennsylvania called Wizard World East in 2002. A year later, they then created Wizard World Texas. A year after that, Wizard World LA. And then in 2005, they added Wizard World Boston. This brought their total number of conventions up to 5 shows within their first 10 years of starting the event. Now, this seemed relatively stable at the time. However, the owners of Wizard World decided that it wasn't enough. And from here on out, we're going to see some drama. So in 2006, they decided to put on an event in Atlanta, which happened to be the same weekend as another Georgia Comic-Con. I believe it's called HeroCon. More than likely purposely chose the same date as this other convention. This convention was 4 hours away from Atlanta. However, Wizard World being as big as it was and bringing these huge celebrities and whatnot, smaller convention knew that their attendance would drop rapidly even though it was 4 hours away. Now, Wizard World at this point has started their diabolical Walmarting plan to infiltrate the convention sector within the areas they want to set up a convention and essentially destroy smaller conventions, bringing the attendance to Wizard World and continuing to grow Wizard World as a company and a name. So they probably purposely chose this date to align with this smaller convention so that they could put that convention in a position to either sell the convention to Wizard World or just put them out of business altogether. But this convention, I think it's HeroCon, I forgot to write it down. They were very beloved in their community, and with that, there was a massive public outcry against Wizard World. They were infuriating the very people they wanted to attend their convention. And at this time, rather than people buying tickets to Wizard World in protest, the HeroCon actually wound up getting an increase in ticket sales. So this Walmart plan of theirs wound up not working. And that, coupled with the optics, they wound up just postponing the Atlanta Comic-Con. This was not the end of the drama with their Walmarting of the convention space. I don't know if you know this. I keep calling it Walmarting because Walmart's expansion plan over its history was to set up a Walmart in smaller towns. You know, Walmart has an incredibly low cost of goods, and it was purposely pushing mom and pop shops out of business and actually destroying local economies. So Walmart has a very bad reputation for this, and they were doing it purposefully so that they could consolidate all of that market into Walmart. And Wizard World was doing the exact same thing. So the drama continues. A couple years later, they also canceled their Texas event and postponed their LA event. But with this recent trouble, they still moved on with purchasing another convention in Toronto, another in New York City. So they're canceling or postponing pre-existing events while simultaneously buying out new events. Personally, that doesn't seem like the best business decision. If you're having problems putting on the shows you already own, why are you expanding? So by 2010, almost 15 years after they purchased their very first convention, they now had 8 planned shows. We had Toronto, Anaheim, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York City, Boston, New Jersey, and Austin. That's a really good lineup of conventions. This company should be incredibly successful, but there was still more drama because the one they were setting up in New York, I believe it used to be called Big Apple Comic-Con, they were trying to compete against New York City Comic-Con, and once again there was an outcry against Wizard World for trying to destroy a beloved local con, and it was not working out for them. They wound up rescheduling their New York City Comic-Con and canceling another in New Jersey. I'm no expert clearly. But from 2005 to 2010, Wizard is incredibly unstable. They are postponing and canceling events left and right. And of course, this was before I discovered Comic-Con, so I have no experience these events or how they were ran or how it was to go to these earlier Wizard World Comic-Cons. But if you were in the loop and you attended any of these, or you were going to attend one that was suddenly canceled, I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your story, so please put it down in the comments so that I can get more background on what it was like to be an attendee at the time. So what does a company that has been relatively successful so far and continuing to grow do after being in business since the early 90s? Go public, which really feels like the destruction of companies these days. I really feel like when a company goes public, that it's supposed to be a sign of success, but how many companies that have we seen over the past like 5 or 6 years go public and then a few years later declare bankruptcy? I don't know. It just doesn't feel like a good move to me. For Wizard World, they thought it was, so they went public in 2012, at the time with a total of 12 shows scheduled for the year, essentially a show a month, all around the country and including Toronto. Decided to pivot very hard into celebrity culture at this time as it was becoming their biggest draw. So they were getting bigger and bigger names, really focusing on autographs and merchandise, and really pushing out the comic book aesthetic over the years. To be fair, they were bringing in people who may never have stepped foot into a comic book convention. So it was a business strategy that worked really well for them. But, so that's 2011. Unfortunately, this rapid expansion and going public and everything wound up being way too much for the company. So they wound up having to cancel 5 out of 12 shows in 2011. At this point, they have been relatively unstable with the consistency of their shows and actually being able to put on everything that they promised since around 2005-2006. And interestingly, at this point in time, they also were struggling too hard to compete against New York City Comic-Con, and they wound up giving up the New York City convention altogether. And the original owner and I believe founder of Big Apple Comic-Con was able to purchase it back from Wizard World eventually. But Wizard continued to host more events, varying the amount of shows each year and growing to become an event even non-nerd people can enjoy. And it looks like my very first Wizard World back in 2014 was actually the second time Wizard World came to St. Louis, with their first one being in 2013. With my very first Wizard World being in 2014, it turns out that that was the last year of the heyday of Wizard World, because the next year, in 2015, Wizard World was reaching its peak in events. It had 25 planned events all over the country and one in Toronto. Even with these events and the popularity of Wizard World, they wound up losing over $4 million that year. And it was finally determined, after all of this time, that they had expanded too rapidly and were not able to sustain the amount of shows that they had planned. They wound up scaling back. In 2016, they scaled back to only 19 shows. By 2018, they only had 13. So we're seeing this rapid decline over a couple of years of Wizard World events. And this is when I discovered them, and I am going when I can. And I had no idea this was going on. The timing itself was very interesting because I specifically remember this being a Comic-Con boom. We had Wizard World, but we also had a bunch of other conventions popping up all over the country, a lot of them very small, but with the growing popularity amongst non-nerdy folk with conventions, people were seeing a market, and more of these were starting to pop up. So at the time that Wizard World could have been expanding, they wound up paying for their previous poor planning and mistakes and had to scale back. Had they waited it out a bit longer and didn't have shareholders to answer to, perhaps they could have weathered the storm and made it back. But that, of course, was not the case. And it's wild to think that at this time, they were getting huge celebrities. There was Stan Lee that was supposed to attend Wizard World St. Louis one year. Unfortunately, that was the year he got really sick. They had Elijah Wood. They had freaking Sean Bean. I never thought Sean Bean would ever show up to something like a convention, but there he was. I got to meet him and it was very exciting. But they had these huge names and huge crowds and huge draws, and they still weren't turning a profit because they expanded too fast, in my opinion. 2016 is where the real drama happens. There was so much turnover in the C-suite. So We had an auditor that wound up getting fired. A CEO was usurped and replaced. One of the founding board members resigned, which wound up being one of the brothers of the original founder. And at this time, the founder had left the company. I think he left the company like 2011 to 13, somewhere around there. And the CMO, the chief marketing officer, he was accused of fraud. This is interesting because the CMO was the other brother of the original founder. Wizard, the company, accused the CMO of setting up really bad deals with the celebrities they were bringing in, purposefully making deals with them that would cause Wizard to lose money, but set the CMO up with, I guess, time and the ability to work with the celebrity to get signed merchandise that allegedly he would then take and give to relatives who owned stores or websites or something like that, who would then sell this signed merchandise. CMO essentially was defrauding the company, according to Wizard, and mishandling contract negotiations and doing things that he was not allowed to do. And in October of 2016, Wizard sued this now ex-CMO. After the lawsuit was filed, because of all of the drama, the share prices dropped, leading to an announcement later that month that Wizard is actually going to run out of money by the end of 2016. The hits kept on coming because by November, the ex-CMO wound up countersuing Wizard, saying that he didn't defraud the company, he was fired illegally, and the only thing that he did wrong was, interestingly enough, not returning his company laptop. The outcome of this case is rather anticlimactic. A year later, in 2017, they settled out of court. And this is the problem with being a publicly traded company. When your shares start to drop, really hurts and impacts companies. If they were a private company, maybe they could have withstood the scandal. Being a public company, I think, really hurt them in this case. Again, I'm no expert, but that's just my opinion. But they continued to put on shows in 2017, 18, and 19. Now, we all know what 2020 did to us and what it did to the convention scene. Everything closed. Wizard had to cancel all of their 2020 shows, and a lot of conventions went out of business. But Wizard World was the one that I fully expected to be able to come back. They seemed too big to fail, but unfortunately fail they did. In 2021, they had to cut their shows down to 6 that year. Granted, it was still the plague time and a lot of cities had restrictions still in place, so I'm not surprised that they had such a small amount of shows they were able to put on. So they're almost back to the original that they had 15 years prior. And by this time, the publishing business had been long closed, so the only thing they had to make revenue was their live events and everything associated with live events. But they announced later in 2021 that they would be selling these last 6 events to Fan Expo, which is still going strong, and they wound up closing the Wizard World doors altogether. And with that, Wizard Entertainment was no more. And of course, the very last show, as I mentioned earlier in this video, was Wizard World Chicago, which I believe took place in October of that year. The official story, of course, is that the plague ended Wizard World, that they just could not recover from the closures and whatnot. But I think this was nearly 20 years of poor decisions. Growing too fast, expanding the company, going public, all of these things I think piled on so that they could not weather their first drama and they could not weather a closure for a couple of years. Granted, a lot of companies couldn't, but I just think that the trouble started back in 2005 and it continued until it finally destroyed the company. So that, my friends, is a long history of my very first Comic Con and the dramatic lead up to its closure. The closest experience we now have is Fan Expo. We want to experience something very similar to what Wizard World was like. Fan Expo is the place to go. They have the size, the celebrities, the cosplay, all of that. And also they have the Masters of Cosplay circuit. So if you're a competitive cosplayer, highly recommend doing that. I got to be a guest at a Fan Expo show, MegaCon Orlando this year, and judge the Masters of Cosplay qualifier and finale, and that was really full circle because I always dreamt of competing at Wizard World St. Louis. Of course, was never to be. I never got to a point where I felt like I was able to compete there, but getting to judge and guest at Fan Expo really felt like coming full circle, even if it's not Wizard World. But Wizard World had such a huge impact on my life and a huge impact on conventions in general, and I would love to know if you had ever attended a Wizard World. Was it one of your favorite shows? What was your favorite thing to do? Did you experience the turmoil or any of the cancellations and such that came about through all the drama? I'd love to hear from you down in the comments below, and any fond memories that you may have. So of course, if you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe for more content from me, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!